You are all here to attend 8 Steps to Effective Use Cases. We're going to be talking about how to create use cases, what ought to be in a use case, how to use use cases. To talk about the 8 steps to effective use cases, we're going to talk about how to identify your system boundaries. That's step 1. Identifying the actors, the external entities to that system that are going to be interacting with the system. We'll talk about determining the interactions between those outside actors and the systems, determining those various interactions. Each interaction will then result in a use case. These are start-to-finish interactions, just not individual steps in an interaction. Then we're going to talk about establishing the pre- and post-conditions to those interactions, what has to be true before you can start the interaction, what has to be true to consider that interaction successfully completed. In step 5, we'll talk about documenting the main success scenario. And then in step 6, we'll talk about documenting branches to that main success scenario that define alternatives and exceptions to that typical or usual main success case. In step 7, we'll talk about merging or creating sub-use cases as appropriate, and we will end in step 8 talking about the additional information that you might want to document for your use cases. Basically, things like who created it, its change history, those types of things. So let's start with step 1, defining the basic boundaries of a use case and defining the boundaries of your system. Where the use cases are depends on what system under consideration you're even considering. For example, if we consider the entire gas station, then actors or outside entities would be things like the customer or the credit card clearinghouse that are outside the boundaries of that system. And they would do start-to-finish interactions with that entire gas station. For example, the customer could come in, purchase gas using a credit card, drive out. Or the credit card clearinghouse could receive a notification and that someone wants to validate a credit card and then go ahead and do that validation. But notice the owner of the gas station, the manager of the gas station, the attendant are just elements within that gas station. So therefore, they are not part of the actors of the system. So defining the boundaries defines who the actors are. So the step 1 and step 2 are basically done in conjunction with each other. To give you another perspective, if we just talk about our gas pay system as the system under consideration, which is just one of the systems within the gas station, then now not only are the customer and the credit card clearinghouse actors, but now the owner and the attendant are going to interact with that gas pay system. So they would also be actors that would potentially have start-to-finish interactions. For example, the owner might kick off the start-to-finish interaction of changing the price of regular gas in the system, or they might kick off the action of running the nightly reports. So where does the cash register fit? And this is part of what you're going to be deciding as you're deciding your system under consideration. Is the cash register part of the gas pay system, or is it an external entity that we have to interact with? This is going to determine whether or not the cash register is an actor or not. Now, if it's inside the system, you're just going to write functional and non-functional requirements for how that cash register is going to interact. If it's outside the system, you have to decide whether or not the gas pay system is going to interact with it. If it is, it's an actor. If it's not, then it's not an actor in your system. For example, if the attendant reads some kind of controller unit and then hand enters the amount of gas sold into the cash register, and the cash register does not interact with the gas pay system, then it's not an actor. However, if the gas pay system sends the gas price to the cash register and it automatically brings up the price of gas, then it would be an actor that you're going to interact with. as part of the gas pay system. To take a much more micro view, you could also take just one portion of the gas pay system as your system under consideration. Now you've got your customers, your credit card clearinghouse, your attendant interacting with that credit card system, but the owner would not, so now the owner's not an actor. But the rest of your gas pay system may now be an actor interacting with that credit card reader. So if you're who the actors are greatly dependent on where your boundaries are of your system under consideration. So let's look at the system under consideration for the rest of this talk at least. We're going to be thinking about the gas pay system. And so we're going to have the owner and the attendant be actors as well as the customer, etc. For each of those actors we have identified then, we're going to determine the interactions with the system for each of those actors, the main tasks or functions that they're going to perform using the system. And this is very much from an actor perspective. For example, the customer might come in and purchase gas using a credit card. That might be one task. Purchasing gas by prepaying the attendant might be another. By post-paying the attendant might be a third interaction. By using a debit card might be a fourth interaction. The attendant might have interactions. For example, they receive an alarm telling them that the receipt printer is out of paper, and they go change the receipt printer and reset the alarm. Or they might put a pump in and out of service. Those might be interactions that they perform with the system. Data acquired, produced, or changed in the system. I already mentioned an example of that when we talked about the owner acquiring the nightly reports, or the owner changing the price of gasoline. Those would be two examples there. Information wanted or given by the system, notifications and alarms. I already mentioned the alarm to the attendant. Now when we're looking at these interactions, we determine who the primary and secondary actors are for each of these interactions. The primary actor is the person who initiates that use case. For example, when the customer comes and swipes their credit card, they are initiating the use case to pay out at the pump with their credit card. When the owner changes the gas price, they're prompting the system and going into the right screen, and they're initiating that use case. They're the primary actor. The other primary actors are actors where the use case is initiated by the system, but for that particular actor. For example, the alarm we mentioned to the attendant did not initiate that alarm, but the alarm was initiated by the system for the attendant, and the attendant was the primary actor because they were at the target of that initiation. Secondary actors are other actors that are also involved in that particular use case. Going back to the example where the customer swipes their credit card, the credit card clearinghouse would be a secondary actor because the system's going to then validate the credit card with them. If there's any notices or alarms that need to go to the attendant as a result of that initiation and interaction, the attendant might also be a secondary actor in that particular use case. It's any other actors that are involved in the use case, that start to finish interaction, other than the actor that initiated it or that it was initiated for. Basic use case diagrams then, just to show you an illustration, it shows the boundaries of the system, in this case our gas pay system. Outside, represented by little stick figures, that's what use cases use to represent the various actors. Now, these don't have to be people like the customer or the owner. They could also be, for example, another software system. The credit card clearinghouse is probably another software system. Or if the cash register was outside the system and we determined it was an actor, it could be a piece of hardware that is an actor that we're interacting with. The actors are any external entities that we are going to interact with. Now, in these use case diagrams, the bubbles represent the various interactions. For example, purchasing gas by post-paying the attendant, or purchasing gas with a credit card, or purchasing a car wash would be interactions initiated by the customer. The arrows going in to the use case diagrams indicate that that actor is the primary actor. The owner would generate the monthly tax reports. The attendant would initiate the interaction by saying, "Next in line, please," to accept payment for the post-pay purchase gas by paying the attendant use case. Now, in these diagrams, you also have arrows that go out. These represent the secondary actors. For example, if I am going to purchase gas by paying the attendant, when I finish purchasing gas, the attendant is going to be notified of that interaction so they know they're going to have something collecting. For purchasing the gas at the pump with the credit card, both the credit card clearinghouse and the attendant may be secondary actors in that use case. Now, generating the monthly reports, notice there is no secondary actor. The owner is the only actor involved in that use case. So once we have identified our boundaries, we've identified our actors, we've identified our interactions, step 4 then is to establish the pre and post conditions. Preconditions, like entry criteria to any process, are things that have to be true before you can start that use case. Post conditions, things that have to be true before that use case is considered successfully completed. For example, if we're purchasing gas out at the pump with our credit card, examples of preconditions might be that I have to have shown up at the pump with something to put gas into. I have to have some kind of card that will go into the slot to initiate the use case. The pump has to actually be in service. Post conditions, things that have to be true to have that use case be considered successful. I have pumped my gas into the container. I got the gas type that I wanted. I got the amount of gas that I wanted. I received my receipt. From the customer's perspective, that's success. Of course, from the owner's perspective, they got paid for their gas. That's one of the owner's success criteria. So all of those would be post conditions, things that have to be true. You know, I've got my receipt if I wanted it. Things that have to be true for the use case to be considered successful. Just to show you an example of a use case then, this is the one for accepting post-payment for the gas. The attendant is the primary actor that says, "Next in line, please." The customer is going to, of course, be interacting with them to pay for the gas, and if they pay for it with a credit card, contacting the bank consortium. Preconditions, I've already successfully pumped my gas, and the customer actually bothered to go in to pay for the gas. Now, examples here might be, I've done this with my husband. I've left him outside pumping gas. I went inside, used the restroom, went and got in line to pay for the gas, got up to the attendant, and he said, "That pump is still pumping out there." So we can't start this use case until we've successfully finished pumping the gas. Of course, on the other hand, if I drive off without paying, this use case will never get initiated either. Post conditions, I received payment. The customer was able to pay for the gas with the payment type of choice. If for some reason it couldn't read my credit card or rejected my credit card, I wouldn't consider that successful. And of course, I received a receipt if I wanted one. Then step 5, you're going to document the main success scenario. This is called the happy path. The big advantage of this is it is going to define at the level of detail appropriate for the audience the start to finish interaction, very much from the stakeholder's perspective, so that you can talk to the stakeholder in their language, the customers, the owner, etc. These are defined in the business language. They can be as detailed as is appropriate for the particular customer. For example, the main success scenario. The attendant acknowledges the customer pays for the gas, the customer is given change and a receipt. Boom, done with the use case. And in fact, Coburn, who's written books on use cases, says keep them up at this very, very high level until just before you're ready to implement them. Don't bother to define all of the details because those details can change over time. Leave them at this very high level to remind yourself what this use case is all about and what the basic steps are. And then drill it down to the more detail just before you're ready to go start drilling it down from there into the requirements for your product. So you're going to document the main success scenario. Now to drill it on down, however, you can get very elaborate. Now this is the two-column approach. There's a saying with use cases, read any one book on use cases, you'll totally understand them, they're simple and straightforward. Read any two books, you'll be totally confused because everybody does them differently. Now I particularly like the two-column approach because already I'm starting to think about what are the inputs coming into my system from that outside world, from the actor's environment, versus what does my system have to do in response to that. And it's already starting to make some of that subdivision. However, these are a little harder to draw. There's nothing wrong with the one-column approach, which is step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, for however many steps. Just put it all in a single column. But now you have to say the attendant does this, the system does that. You may add a few more words here and there. But to walk you through this, the attendant greets the customer and asks which pump. The customer identifies the pump number. The attendant pulls the system for the pump information. The system reports the gallons pumped and the total price. The attendant confirms that price with the customer and acknowledges the price in the system. The system accepts the price and displays the price on the cash register. Notice the cash register is part of this system. We're interacting with it here. So it is actually part of the system under consideration. The attendant asks if there's other items. The customer says no. The attendant asks for payment type, and they pay in cash, and so on. I'm not going to go into any more detail than that, but it's literally step by step by step by step. Now, how much detail is enough? You've got to decide for your intended audience. The more you drill it down, the more time and energy it's going to take, but the more information you have. One of the things that I really love about use cases is if I get this detail down, I can start really understanding the stakeholders' needs and how they're doing business. I can take these back, since they're written in their language, to those stakeholders and do a little mini walkthrough with them, literally just walking through these steps and saying, have I got it all? Are there any alternatives or exceptions or any ways you do it differently than this that we haven't documented? Because it's in their language and they can understand these and walk through them. Then as a business analyst, we can convert these into the actual product level requirements. Each step here may become one or more product level requirements, things the software has to do. On the other hand, if you're doing Agile, these flow very well into writing the test cases for test-driven development. Each step here becomes one or more test cases, and then those test cases flow in as the product level requirements for the system. Whichever way you're doing this, this becomes the major input to doing the more detailed product level definition, either in product level requirements or in test cases. Now, once we have this main success scenario, what we call the happy path, everybody's happy at the end, the most typical way of doing it, then we start considering in step 6 alternatives or exceptions. Alternatives and exceptions always branch off the main use case. Now, again, there's many ways of documenting these. What I tend to do is, 5A is the first alternative off of step 5. 5B would be the second alternative. 5C would be the third alternative off of that step. And then it's just alternative 5A, step 1, 2, 3, and 4. So now instead of the attendant confirming the price and acknowledging it with the system, the customer says, nope, that's not the price. I didn't spend $52.95. I only pumped $14 worth of gas. Then the attendant has to have a way of canceling the previous transaction. The system will reset to no pump identified and return back to step 3, where the customer gives the new pump number and the attendant pulls that new pump number into the system. So there's one alternative. Another alternative might be, instead of saying, no, I don't have anything else, the customer purchases Tootsie Rolls or slushies or other items. The attendant enters the price of each item into the cash register. The system accepts the price and displays the ongoing running total on the cash register, and at the end return back to step 8. Notice these typically always branch off of the main success scenario. Typically they either branch back to the main success scenario, or in some cases they can complete as themselves and not branch back. They could be a complete finished scenario without returning back to the main use case. Another example might be that the system can't talk to the pump and it gets some kind of error message, in which case the attendant has to go manually read and enter the cash register information into the cash register. So now you have to have ways of both doing it automatically through the system but also manually through the attendant. Exceptions are simply alternatives that don't get you to the happy path. Alternatives still get back to the happy path, to the completion criteria. You still manage to accomplish the task in a successful way. Exceptions don't. For example, there might be an exception because the credit card was invalid or it wasn't one of the types that's accepted. I'm trying to use Discover card and it only accepts MasterCard, Visa, and American Express. That would be an example of an exception. I did not get to pay with my payment type of choice preference. Or another exception might be that my credit card was reported as stolen or over the limit or expired. I had that happen just the other day. My credit card company is very diligent about identifying purchases that are suspect. And somebody had charged $1.99 to Japanese Airlines. Well, I never have used Japanese Airlines in the past, and $1.99 is a weird ticket price. And they closed the account. They literally put a security hold on it, and I had to call in and say, no, that wasn't my thing, and obviously my credit card had been breached. So that might be, again, I didn't get to pay with my payment type of choice. Now, hopefully I had another payment type or cash in my wallet. Another exception might be I did not have an alternative and a way of paying, and there's got to be some kind of process for suspending the transaction because you don't want to hang the gas pump up for some period of time and then being able to come back and recall that transaction. So some of these, and exploring through use cases, might lead you to the need to identify a whole new use case, which is come back later and pay when you do have cash. For example, I went to a gas station once. My husband had taken my last $20 out of my wallet, unbeknownst to me. They took my driver's license. I came back a few minutes later with the cash, paid for it, got my driver's license back. But they don't want to have to hold up the transaction for that period of time. So the intent here is to explore all the different ways that the users, stakeholders, and other external entities are going to interact with this system. Now, just a few other exceptions. You might have an exception because you can't communicate with the pump. Oh, I'm sorry. This is just showing you the ones we just did again, written out as, you wouldn't actually bump them out as things like this, but you would put them together in the table as steps in the use case. Step 7, then, you are going to think about merging or creating sub-use cases. What's called an include is where there's similar behavior in multiple use cases. For example, whether I'm using my debit card, my credit card, prepay, post-pay out at the pump, the same instructions for selecting gas type, pumping the gas, putting it back in to the receiver, that same set of steps are going to be the same no matter what. Or if I have two different use cases, for example, pay inside with a credit card, prepay, pay outside with a credit card, postpay, or pay inside with postpay, pay outside with a credit card, all of those are going to include that same read and validate credit card information. So instead of repeating that over and over again in multiple use cases, we can break it out into a sub-use case and just include it. This keeps a lot of the redundancy out of our use cases. Almost think of it as a subroutine that's being called by higher level routine in a procedural language. A generalization is simply one use case similar to another use case, but a bit more. For example, you might have a generalization that says, put the card into the card reader upside down or backwards one or more times. I always blame it on the fact that I'm left-handed, and the thumb picture is always wrong, but it seems like I'm always putting the credit card in wrong and then having to turn it over and put it back. So a generalization might be to put the credit card in one or more times incorrectly. An extend is simply a generalization that occurs at a particular point in time. For example, you might have an extend that says if they've selected the car wash, then extend it to this car wash use case. But under normal case, if they say no, we don't want a car wash, then you just continue on and do not do that extend. So you're going to merge and generalize and come up with these sub-use cases as appropriate to reduce the amount of redundancy, to reduce the amount of documentation that you have in your use case. Step 8, you're going to talk about recording additional information on your use case. I recommend that every use case have some kind of unique identifier so you can refer to it. I put these right into my traceability matrices. I can literally talk about use case number 12, step 3, and that becomes requirements 392, 397, 398, or whatever it traces to. The big advantage of that is then if somebody wants to change one of those requirements, the product level requirements, I can come back and say, well, that was off of step 8 of this use case. Has the use case really and truly changed? Who are the stakeholders associated with this use case? Who are the actors? Go back and do a more thorough impact analysis to make sure the change is really valid. I like to give my use cases a name, and typically I do some kind of verb and noun combination like purchase gas, post-pay at the attendant. The date it was created and who it was created by, again, so that I can go back and talk to those people. They may have additional information if I'm trying to drill this down to the product level requirements or into test cases. The other big advantage of these in testing is not only can you drill this down into individual test cases, but then you can chain those test cases back together to do the start-to-finish interactions. These use cases blend right into scenario-based testing very, very easily. So the date and time, and then the modification history over time. As these things are modified, who changed it, when was it changed, why was it changed, so that you have some kind of status. This is the basic configuration management activity of use cases. Now, this can be as little or as much documentation as necessary. I've actually seen use cases up on the board, basic post-it notes and flip chart paper up on the wall, and then I just go change it by redlining it in a different color and putting my initials and the date on it. So this does not have to be horrendous documentation by any means. We're not trying to create huge amounts of paperwork here, but it's always nice to know when it changed and who changed it, just in case you need to go back to them. A use case description, for me this is usually a sentence or two. In fact, many times going back, I may just use those use case diagrams that we talked about with a sentence or two and leave it, like I said, up at that level until I'm ready to implement it, and then go drill it down to the more complete use cases that we've talked about. It's also easy to prioritize these use cases. This is the point where you can start prioritizing and only work on the appropriate ones at a time. This can also start feeding into performance type requirements. If you start looking at things like frequency of use, is this use case going to be used, how many of these do you have to execute per hour or per day? That can give you some throughput numbers. How many of these can be executed at the same time? Capacity numbers. For example, 30 people can all be pumping gas or all be validating their credit cards at the same time because these interactions are happening. You may also want to have some non-functional requirements related to response times. How quickly do these use cases have to be done? So any appropriate frequency of use, performance, other information like that, start capturing it here. Start asking those questions of your stakeholders so that you're capturing the non-functional requirements as well. You may also want to talk to them at this point even about things like usability. What would make this easier to use, easier to learn to use, more pleasurable to use? Listen to those adjectives and adverbs that they talk about and start folding those into some usability requirements. Then we can talk about any related business rules. Business rules are the restrictions on the system established by the business itself or through government regulations, those kinds of things. For example, purchasing gas might have business rules by the business that say we only accept MasterCard, Visa, and American Express, or that we only allow $100 per transaction on a credit card. Those might be examples of business rules. You may also have government regulations. For example, the state's weights and measures people may have government regulations about the accuracy of how much gas you get. If you pay for $1 worth of gas, you get exactly $1 worth of gas to the nearest hundredth of a gallon or whatever the requirement is for the regulation. And are there any assumptions associated with this use case? Okay, so just to review then, the 8 steps, you've got to define your system boundaries. If you don't know what your system under consideration is, you can't identify the external entities. You've got to know what the boundary is, what the system is you're even writing use cases for. Once you've got the boundaries of the system, you identify the actors. These can be people, other software systems, special hardware, anything outside your system that is going to interact with your system. Step 3 is to determine those start-to-finish interactions. I'm not talking about I'm going to go scan my credit card. I'm talking start to finish. I'm going to scan my credit card. I'm going to select the gas type. I'm going to pump my gas. I'm going to get my receipt. Start from the time that entity starts interacting with the system on any given interaction until they are completely finished with it. And you get to decide what, those are, what those interactions need to be for your system. The more you can explore and the more comprehensive you can be of getting all your interactions, the more your system is going to meet its intended use in the field. The more complete your requirements and your test cases are going to be. You define your preconditions and your postconditions. What has to exist before you can start this use case? What does success look like? Postconditions define what a successful use case is. The main success scenario, also called the happy path, are just the typical or most usual start-to-finish interactions. Again, these can be as detailed as necessary. The recommendation is early on you leave them at a very high level. I come in, I swipe my credit card, I pump my gas, I get my receipt, I leave. Just to remember what they are. And then as you're ready to actually implement these, get back with your stakeholders, have the conversations, drill them down into all the alternatives, all the exceptions, all the detailed steps. that flow into then your product level requirements and or test cases as appropriate. It's a way of capturing the detailed information from your stakeholders in their language so that you can talk to them, have them review it, make sure you've captured everything. Then make sure you've defined those alternatives and exceptions. Alternatives are simply alternate ways through the scenario that still get you to the post conditions. You still have success. Exceptions are branches off that main success scenario that do not end in success. You don't end up meeting one or more of the post conditions. But these are simply two ways of thinking about what are the other ways or other paths through the interaction that might exist, that need to be documented and defined. They lead to additional requirements. Think about merging or creating. If you've got too many tiny little ones, it may need to merge them together into a more start-to-finish interaction with the system. Or if you have a lot of redundancy, you may need to break things out into sub-use cases, like the includes, generalizations, and exceptions we talked about. Don't forget to record your additional information. Again, you need to decide what other information is important to you. I'm not trying to say what I gave you was a set of example or typical information. I don't want to make this documentation heavy. Only capture what's going to be useful and usable information to you later on. But those can also lead you to additional requirements like the associated business rules, like the performance requirements or usability requirements, those kinds of non-functional requirements, by helping or talking about and capturing that additional information. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you all very much for your kind interest.